Coba saja. I'm Shidalu. Oh my god. In the first episode, we're talking about steak.
Mainly because my producer keeps seeing all these guys on dating apps claiming they really know how to cook steak.
I seriously can't stand people like that. They all think they're great at cooking steak. I'm bringing in an expert to break it down.
So my job is to really break this down. Take this overdone topic
And explain it so well that no one else has anything to add. In this episode,
I'll walk you through the science behind it. I'll also show you how I make steak taste great. Enough talk. Let's get into it. So,
why is it so hard?
to fake steak skills?
And honestly, dessert making might be more useful. My producer told me
A lot of guys on dating apps say
they're great at cooking steak.
really know good steak and can even butcher meat. That kind of thing
Is honestly really hard. Because steak is about more than just science.
Even though I believe in science, I think there's a lot of art to it too.
These days, on YouTube and all over the internet, you'll see all kinds of ways to cook steak.
Getting meat to that perfect doneness really does take artistry. If you only half know what you're doing,
You're probably better off learning desserts, because that's much more scientific. You follow the recipe exactly, then maybe add a little aesthetic touch. But you can skip that part too. Take past cheesecake, for example. As long as you get the recipe right
and get a nice brown top, it'll be delicious.
But steak is really hard. So, mau deketin cewek?
Stop saying you're great at cooking steak.
Trust me, my producer will crack up.
Wow. So if steak is already hard to cook, let's bust
Some of those myths.
For example, this idea that high heat locks in juices sounds plausible, but it's actually a myth.
Here's why. With a good steak, you see a lot of smoke. But have you ever thought about what causes it?
That smoke comes from the juices evaporating and carrying fat with them,
Creating that hazy
look. It's made up of tiny oil droplets and steam, so you can't lock in the juices. The next thing you need to think about is the internal temperature.
dan suhu inti is hard to get just right, because meat is a poor conductor of heat.
Once you understand that, when it comes to cooking steak,
Everything else starts to make sense.
at home, you just can't get
That steakhouse, open fire flavor.
With a home stove, you can't get truly restaurant-level results. I actually agree with that. When I ate at one of the world's top steakhouses, I saw some incredible overhead broilers, the kind that can char fish until it's crisp.
You'll also see people cooking over an open fire, which is really famous. Australia, apa?
Like fire dough,
Where they cook with charcoal or wood di atas api terbuka. That kind of intense heat instantly forms kerak pada steak.
a home stove obviously can't do.
But does that mean you have to give up the art of cooking steak?
I don't think so.
What we really need to understand is this. When it comes to steak, internal temperature really matters. Meat is a poor conductor of heat.
And once you know how to balance that, you can still make a great steak.
Alright, so if you're starting to understand what open fire steak is,
Or steak cooked in an overhead broiler, then next,
you just need to understand internal temperature, how a crust forms, and why meat is a poor conductor of heat. Gaya steak kamu can turn into real expertise. What is accelerated sous vide?
it uses an app
To calculate heat capacity.
and the gap from the steak's internal temperature
Masukkan jumlah air, ukuran steak,
and the temperature.
and it'll tell you.
Maybe it can cut the time from 3 hours
To just an hour and a half,
or even down to the minute.
then I can get the steak to the ideal internal temperature.
If you're still not following, I'd say keep listening. Let's become
Real steak guys who actually know steak.
My producer put together an online steak cooking formula. Let's take a look.
First, thaw the steak. Next, pat the steak dry.
Then start searing the steak.
And finally, slice it up and dig in. As for the prep, it says to thaw the steak first.
It says you need to take the frozen steak
And thaw it in the refrigerator overnight.
or thaw it under running water if you're in a hurry.
Pastikan cair sempurna. Next, pat it dry.
Then cook it. When it comes to seasoning,
Sprinkle coarse salt and black pepper on both sides. Let it sit so the seasoning can absorb. Those 3 steps are basically right. Let me explain why they matter.
if it's not fully thawed,
The steak's internal temperature will be close to 0 derajat Celsius, or even below freezing.
then when you cook it,
As I mentioned, meat is a poor conductor of heat. Jika pan 200 derajat Celcius, or 250 derajat Celcius, atau broilernya 300 derajat Celcius, bahkan 400 derajat Celcius. that heat still can't really penetrate the center. You just end up with a burnt outside and an icy center. Panggang kalkun pada 145 derajat Celcius atau 150 derajat Celcius. It takes 3 hours. I can't just raise the temperature and shorten the cooking time. The heat just won't get into the meat. The classic example is this, 145 derajat Celcius for 10 menit. Can I do 1450 derajat Celcius for 1 minute instead? Nope. Coba pikir. Tentu tidak. So fully thawing, it is crucial because meat is a poor conductor of heat. Second, pat the steak dry. Because if you don't dry it off, there are 2 serious consequences. One is nasty oil splatter and smoke. But, yang even worse, steakmu tak akan enak. Why won't it taste good? When the meat is searing in the pan, if the surface isn't dry, the moisture will absorb most of the heat. Coming from the pan, then turn to steam and escape. Do you know it takes 540 calories to vaporize water? That means the heat in the pan is basically wasted. Next is seasoning. There are a few schools of thought on seasoning. I've seen quite a few scientific comparisons on the topic. When it comes to seasoning steak, you need to do it early. You definitely don't salt it after searing. Garam dulu, baru sear. Because it does 2 things. First, the salt gets into the meat more easily. That even seasoning makes the steak taste much better. Second, there's the benefit of osmotic pressure. It lightly dehydrates the surface. Then after a while, once the brine is reabsorbed, the meat becomes fully seasoned. Ingat takeaway-nya. Pre-seasoning is very important. Next, let's start searing the steak. Heat the pan, add the steak, rest it, sear again, rest, and so on. I think this part is mostly correct. What matters most is resting. Most people just don't rest the steak because they don't know what it's for. And I totally get that. Because in Chinese or Taiwanese cuisine, there's no resting step. No dish has that step. Because we don't really work with large cuts of meat. What's the biggest cut we usually cook? Braised pork knuckle or braised pork belly. Those are braised, not seared. So you don't need to rest them. First, heat the pan. Use a pan that can handle high heat. Cast iron skillet. Heat it on high until it starts to smoke. Next, add the steak. You'll hear it sizzle. And that means the pan is hot enough. Now start searing. Sear each side for 1 sampai 2 minutes until browned. Let's start with the pan heat. Right now, there are basically 2 camps. 1, hot pan, hot oil. The other says a cold pan, cold oil. Or a cold pan with no oil. If you're using a non-stick pan, starting with a cold pan and no oil is totally fine. 1 opsi, cold sear method. It takes longer. It can take 10 to 20 minutes, sometimes well over 10 minutes. And you'll end up with a steak without much of a crust, but with very even doneness. And a really delicious result. That's one camp. The other camp is the one I mentioned earlier. The hot pan, hot oil method. Then the steak hits the pan and goes sizzle. And it forms a beautiful crust. But when it comes to internal temperature, it really must manage it well. How do you do that? With lots of resting. The heat from the outside can move inward evenly. Second, the juices inside won't be moving around as much. They can slowly settle back into balance, so less juice runs out when you cut into it. It does say to wrap it in aluminum foil while it rests. If your kitchen is very hot, and kitchens usually are, I don't think it matters that much because you won't be resting it that long. But if you really care, I think you can cover it with a lid or wrap it in aluminum foil. But usually, the kitchen is like a battlefield. You rarely have time to fuss with foil, unless steak is the only thing you're cooking. Wrapping it in foil is really just to keep it from losing heat. But still, steak is a poor conductor of heat. Tak mudah dingin. It doesn't heat up easily, but it doesn't cool down easily either. Pikirkan. If meat were a good conductor of heat, then when you take a bath or soak in hot spring, you'd end up sous videing yourself. Dad. Next, searing it again. Or this whole resting part. This is really important. If your meat is thick, then you need more rounds of resting and searing. Don't assume those steak formulas online. Let's say sear once and rest. Sear kedua, rehat lagi. Mean your steak is ready to eat. If your steak is thick, you probably need to sear it 3 or 4 times and rest it 3 or 4 times. If you're cooking something where doneness really matters, like duck breast, for example, searing it 5 or 6 times can be perfectly reasonable, but over very low heat, so thickness really matters. At most supermarkets and warehouse stores, the meat is usually about 2 centimeter thick. For cuts like that, sear it twice and let it rest, and it'll turn out great. Sometimes, if you're in a rush and you've got enough experience, 1 searing is enough. Then let it rest properly. A proper rest is crucial. I have to keep stressing this. Meat is a poor conductor of heat,
So for heat to move through it, it takes time. You need to give the meat that time. The second thing is letting the juices fully settle back so the meat can reabsorb them. My producer put together a few tips. Pick a steak that isn't too thick. 2,5 atau 3 cm is easier to control. Sangat setuju. A very thin steak is hard to cook and a very thick one is hard too. Around 3 cm is really good. Thickness for beginners. Of course, if you can. Get some really good meat, filet mignon. It's great when cut thick. And if a thick cut steak isn't fully cooked, so what? I'm telling you, it tastes amazing, even rare, so that's fine too. If the crust forms nicely, then even if it's rare to medium rare inside, kurasa sangat lezat. Tapi yang penting apa? Season ahead. It's crucial. Next, the oil needs to be very hot, but that's really just the visible part of it. The oil only gets hot if the pan itself is hot. Say my pan is 1 cm thick and the oil is 0,5 cm deep. You can think of it as adding 0,5 cm of thickness to the pan. That's roughly the idea. So when people say the oil needs to be very hot, if the pan is thin, just use a bit more oil. That mimics the effect of a thicker pan. Even a really thin non-stick pan, thin as a ping pong paddle, just a basic non-stick pan, masih bisa sear great steak? Yes. Just use a bit more oil. That gives it the effect of a thicker pan. So when people talk about really high oil temperature, use oil. A bit more of it. But if you're using a thick cast iron skillet, you really just need the pan to be very hot. Just to be clear, this is the hot sear method. This isn't the trendy cold sear method. A lot of good steaks in bars are done with the cold sear method because it doesn't create much smoke. You know, too much smoke means it's not a bar anymore. It turns into a seafood restaurant. Later on, I picked up this trick from some bartenders and bar cooks. I was like, damn, that works too. Super low heat. Turn your portable butane stove down to the lowest flame, like the candle flame in an ancestral hall. It can cook a steak to perfection. Next is checking doneness. The best way to check doneness is to stick in a thermometer. Now, there are lots of methods online, like pinching your earlobe, pressing the tip of your nose, or touching your chin, or making an OK sign and feeling your fingertip, or doing that Guanyin hand pose and feeling your fingertip, or keep just your ring finger to feel how firm it is and judge whether it's rare, medium, or well done. Those methods are somewhat accurate, but I'd still suggest you do that only after the steak has rested properly. When the meat is still piping hot, poking it won't be all that accurate. But once you have enough experience, your hand and your brain will correct for that automatically. Thermometer tetap saya sarankan. A thermometer, the kind you stick into the meat, is only about $6 Amerika Serikat. The value for money is incredible. You'll instantly become a real steak guy. You really know your stuff, right? Just use a thermometer to check doneness, okay? Next, my producer also put together some notes on oven then sear and low temperature cooking. So oven then sear means starting in the oven, or reverse it, sear then roast. That means searing it first, then putting it in the oven. That's more how restaurants do it. Because in restaurants, it saves manpower. If one person has to stand at the station watching the steaks, it's easier to just set a timer. Sear the outside till crisp, then transfer it to the oven. Now, when it comes to heat transfer, it's mostly happening through radiation. The tray also conducts, tapi terutama radiasi, that raises the internal temperature. But it takes longer karena konduksi kurang efisien. It's a good method, but I think it's a more advanced technique. Oven susah dibersihkan kan? Don't even want to use one. Cleaning the inside is such a hassle. If one pan can do it, I'd rather just use one pan. Next is sous vide. You use a sous vide circulator, vacuum seal the meat and put it in. Then cook it low and slow for a long time. Can it make beef softer and more tender? I'm skeptical. But it can keep the meat's internal temperature in a perfect state. I think it's great. But if you're asking whether sous vide, low temperature aging, or low temperature cooking can make beef shank really tender, I actually tried one method, ultrasound, in a sous vide setup. In that constant temperature water bath, ada ultrasound. That can make the meat more tender. But that kind of tenderness is still a bit different from filet mignon, sengkel sapi. Empu, bisa pakai pisau garpu? Yes, it can. It's pretty interesting. But on that note, I really think Taiwan, China has a lot of great things down that go really well with steak. But for purists like salt and pepper, I personally still love that. For example, really great salt
like fleur de sel from Guérande in France. Honestly, China has great salt flakes now too.
You can find really good ones around the Siku district. Or,
For example, we also have algae salt made in the Japanese style.
it contains a lot of
Compounds from broken down algae.
like free amino acids that can bring the meat's umami to another level. And if you're open to it,
I really recommend trying China's aged soy sauce or soy sauce with steak.
when we make steak sauce,
There's actually a kind of all-purpose sauce. You use the fond stuck to the pan. All that good stuff.
we use oil or water or a little wine to loosen it up a bit.
After reducing it, mix in some mustard. Reduce it again, and you've got a very French-style sauce.
What I do is
Rinse the pan with some soy sauce.
and you see the fat and liquid start to separate. Then add a little butter.
Just a small spoonful.
It'll emulsify and come back together.
Then pour it over the steak. It makes an amazing sauce. Alright, so now you know high heat doesn't lock in juices. Resting the meat is what actually keeps them in. I think that sense of ease in life doesn't just make your life better, it also makes your steak taste better.
If there's anything else you want to know about food science,
Be sure to leave me a comment.
At this point in the show, I do have a goal. If we hit 10,000 subscribers by the end of the year,
4 digits, okay? Let's do that again. Cuma 1,000.
I'll line up a bunch of anime works for Shi Dalu to roast. If you're interested in this idea, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe. Share it with your friends.
And comment with any works.
Cover, comment di bawah. Bye-bye.